Welcome back, life science learners, to our final segment for today. We've been looking at a revision lesson on human reproduction with a special focus on the menstrual and the ovarian cycles. Let's continue trying to understand how we can better improve the understanding of these concepts. In our next bit, we're going to look at some terminology, and then we'll take some questions that require a bit more in-depth understanding. Right. So, provide the correct biological terms for the following statements. And guys, the best way to revise any section is to have a terminology list. And I often tend to, encourage the learners that I teach to create a list of terms at the beginning of your notes and write those terms down. And so those can be a quick reference that you have in terms of when revising this section. So this part of the segment will actually help us to recollect some of those terms that you would have made a list of as you started this section. So the first concept, the release of ripe ovum from the ovary of a female mammal. So guys, when an ovum is released from the ovary, we refer to that process as ovulation. And we notice that in the cycles that we illustrated early on in humans, ovulation is linked to the release of high amounts of FSH, and that will stimulate the production of the follicle. And around day 14, LH peaks, and that process is stimulated by the hormone LH. The next question, the remainder of the Graafian follicle after fertilization in the female ovary. So what happens after fertilization is that when ovulation occurs, the Graafian follicle ruptures and then an ovum is released. But we know that that Graafian follicle then becomes a structure known as the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum is what's remaining, or the new structure that is formed after the process of ovulation. So the question there, the answer to that would be the corpus luteum. Question number 3. The hollow organ in mammals in which the embryo develops. Again, the word develops. So the embryo, remember, implants within the uterine lining, and it's the uterus in which all of this development or gestational development occurs. So the answer to that question would be the uterus. Let's move on to a few more on this. The diploid cell in the follicle of the ovary, which forms the ovum after meiosis. So again, the diploid cell in the follicle of the ovary. So this would be pointing to the primary follicle, and that is what develops and will become what we refer to as the ovum, or release an ovum around ovulation. Question number 5. The monthly cyclic secretion of blood and the lining of the uterus when fertilization has not occurred. So again, the cyclic events of the release of blood and endometrial tissue when fertilization has not occurred is referred to as the process of menstruation. And menstruation generally happens between days 1 to about day 6, or even 5, 6, or 7. So that's the average time that it takes for the process of menstruation to occur. Okay, a few more on terms. The hormone produced by the pituitary gland that causes the maturing of the follicle surrounding the oocyte and stimulates the supply of nutrients. So again, a mouthful. So let's go back to it. So it's the hormone that we need to identify that is produced by the pituitary gland that causes the maturing of the follicle surrounding the oocyte. So guys, remember that there are two hormones produced by the pituitary gland. The one hormone is FSH and the other is LH. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and the other is the luteinizing hormone. So if you remember that the follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the development of the primary follicle, it would be FSH. That would be the correct answer. If you're confused between LH, remember that LH stands for luteinizing hormone, and that targets the corpus luteum, which obviously develops post-ovulation. So that would be after day 14. So the answer to this question is FSH. Question 7, the process by which the haploid egg cells or ova are produced in the follicles of the ovary. So that process in which the haploid egg cells are produced is called oogenesis. And so that is meiosis, where eggs are produced, called oogenesis. Question 8. A hormone produced by the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, so the pituitary gland, that stimulates the release of estrogen in the bloodstream that causes ovulation. Okay, so again, the hormone that stimulates ovulation, as I mentioned earlier on, is called luteinizing hormone, or LH, and that is the hormone that targets the Graafian follicle, causing it to rupture, releasing an ovum. Question number 9. A hormone secreted by the ovaries causing ovulation. Okay, so again, secreted by the ovaries, the hormone that's secreted by the ovaries causing ovulation would be high levels of progesterone. Okay, so that would be progesterone. Finally, question 10. The hormone secreted by the corpus luteum when the egg cell or the ovum is fertilized to ensure pregnancy. So the corpus luteum stimulates the ovary to produce progesterone, and progesterone is a hormone that actually maintains the lining of the endometrium in case fertilization has occurred. So the hormone here would be, when fertilization does occur, would be progesterone that would maintain the lining and maintain the levels of progesterone in the blood. So guys, that's a wrap of this question, where we've spent some time looking at some difficult concepts, and as I mentioned, these can be very confusing, and I think it's important that you read the question well and you're able to refer to a list of terms that you've written down to have a very quick access to these. The next question: study the diagram below showing the sequence of events of the development of the ovum in a 28-day cycle. So here is obviously an enlarged diagram showing you the ovum, and this is the context to where the ovum is, and if we were to draw in the fallopian tubes would be here, and that would be the fimbriae. So this is the context of where the ovary is, and this is pointing to various structures that are developing in the ovary. So here, if you look at it, you've got the primary follicle developing, and that's the direction of development. Here we have a mature Graafian follicle that develops, and we're seeing a process here where an oocyte or an ovum is released, and we see that process continuing towards here. So that's the starting point here. That's the midpoint here around where we know that ovulation occurs, and then finally we see the degeneration of that corpus luteum occurring here. So again, a typical ovary that we see often in a question. Let's look at what questions are based on this. So the first question is, identify the following. Follicle labeled A, and if we go to that diagram, guys, follicle labeled A points to this structure that is developing, and that's the Graafian follicle. And we know that the Graafian follicle is that structure that develops and releases an oocyte around day 14. So it's the Graafian follicle that we have developing. Okay. The next question is, identify structure labeled C. And if we go to C, C is indicated right here, and structure C is essentially what happens to the corpus luteum or the Graafian follicle after ovulation is that it forms the corpus luteum. So that would be a dead follicle called the corpus luteum, and we can clearly see that there. And its function is linked to the production of progesterone from the ovary after ovulation. Process B shown, or the process shown here at B would be that process where we clearly see the release of an ovum around this structure here. So that's the mature Graafian follicle that has ruptured, and that's the ovum that is released, and that process we refer to as is ovulation. So ovulation is the release of an oocyte around day 14. We've got to identify the following. Hormone responsible for the formation of part A. If we look at part A, guys, the formation of that Graafian follicle is stimulated by a pituitary hormone. And if you remember the word follicle, its stimulation is due to a hormone called follicle stimulating hormone. So the hormone responsible for that is called FSH, and it's released from the pituitary gland. The next question would be, we've got to identify the hormone responsible for the formation of part C. So part C is the corpus luteum, and if we look at the pituitary gland, it produces two hormones, FSH and LH. So FSH, we mentioned, targets the primary follicle, stimulating its development. However, LH is responsible for maintaining the structure here called the corpus luteum. So the hormone that is responsible for the formation of part C is called luteinizing hormone. Again, corpus luteum stimulates is stimulated by luteinizing hormone. Great stuff. Let's look at the next part of this question. What type of cell division resulted in the formation of part D? Guys, again, we're linking this again to meiosis and hormones, which is the endocrine. So we know that part D is the ovum, and that process of ovum formation is linked to a process of meiosis called oogenesis. And so that is meiosis, where oogenesis produces part D, which is the ovum. Question 3. State whether fertilization took place in this 28-day cycle. Now guys, often this question is based on a graph that illustrates the levels of progesterone. And we know that when the levels of progesterone remain high post day 28, we could infer that there is a possibility that fertilization has occurred. However, here we presented with the ovary, and we notice that towards the latter part, let's look at post-ovulation. So we can assume that if fertilization takes place, we know that the corpus luteum will remain intact. However, this image shows you the degeneration of the corpus luteum. And so if we assume that fertilization had taken place, we would have had to have seen the corpus luteum being maintained throughout the next trimester. And that is important because the corpus luteum continues to produce progesterone, which actually maintains the lining of the endometrium, ensuring that when implantation takes place, that implantation is maintained until the placenta develops. So this would be obviously the degeneration of the corpus luteum, which would indicate that there was no fertilization that took place here, and hence I can infer that because of the corpus luteum degenerating, there was no fertilization that took place. Okay, so explain your answer to the question. That's essentially, as I mentioned, because there is a degeneration in the size of the corpus luteum, one could infer that no fertilization has taken place. Because we know that when fertilization does take place, the corpus luteum needs to be maintained, and that continues to produce progesterone, which clearly is not indicated in this image. Right. So let's move on to the next part of this question. Explain how and why the production of FSH is inhibited when fertilization takes place. Now guys, if we remember that FSH is a hormone that is produced by the pituitary gland to stimulate the development of a new follicle. So the question points explain how and why the production of FSH is inhibited. So the simple rationale for this question is FSH needs to be inhibited because we now have fertilization taking place. When fertilization takes place, it means that an egg will now continue its development within the endometrium. So the need for a new formation of a new egg is not there, and hence the pituitary gland will not be able to produce a new egg. And that is because when fertilization occurs, we know that this structure called the corpus luteum remains intact. And so the corpus luteum will then stimulate high levels of progesterone. High levels of progesterone in turn have a negative feedback mechanism on the pituitary gland, meaning that the pituitary gland will not produce FSH. And this in turn will mean that the levels of FSH decrease significantly. Considering that fact, it's important that we also recognize that this is the concept that we use, or that is being used in many contraceptive pills that female may take to avoid conception. So that is based on that these pills contain levels of progesterone and estrogen that suppress the pituitary gland from producing a new egg. So essentially suppressing the levels of FSH so that no egg is produced and no ovulation occurs. And that's the rationale for that question. Okay, so guys, we obviously have looked at the various hormones. We've looked at the interactions between the various structures. In our next question, we would have discussed this. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of this segment, but before we wrap up, it's important that we have an overview of what we looked at. So we've looked at the male and female reproductive systems, we've looked at the menstrual cycle and the processes occurring during in the ovary, such as ovulation and menstruation. It's important that we remember the two hormones FSH and LH produced from the pituitary gland, and we remember that the ovarian hormones progesterone and estrogen are significantly important in maintaining the thickness of the endometrium. Guys, you've been a fantastic audience. I trust that you've benefited from this revision lesson. Go back to your drawing boards, look at the male and female reproductive systems, draw these diagrams out, label them, learn their structures and their functions, and don't forget to refer to this graph, probably the most important graph in summarizing a total understanding of this section. You've been a great audience, guys. Hope you have enjoyed the lesson. See you soon. Have a bio-lekker day. Cheers.